Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Baum with FMI, the Food Industry Association, and thanks for joining us for this webinar, Sustainability from Due Diligence to ESG Competitive Advantage. Over the next hour or so, we'll be covering a multitude of topics, making the definitive sustainability business case. We'll outline some of the common mistakes that companies make with their sustainability programs. We'll provide you with some consumer insights in the way they feel about sustainability as one of their drivers of the path to purchase. We'll talk about best practices for developing a strategic, performance-driven, and sustainable competitive advantage. We'll also be providing a number of tools and resources to pressure test your sustainability results versus your actual activities. So just before we get started, a couple of housekeeping details. We will be recording this webinar so that you can revisit it on demand for your future use. And if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature down at the bottom of the screen. We will make every attempt to get to your questions at the end of the presentation. As I said, there's a lot of ground to cover today. So if we don't get to your questions, we will provide a full Q&A with responses in our follow-up email. So let's get started. So we're going to do a quick poll question. And the question is, how would you describe the overall state of your organization's current sustainability readiness? And you've got a couple of options here. And by the way, just to give you some parameters as you're thinking about filling in the answer there, consider issues like your current carbon footprint, where you are with your consumer insights, and the quality of your sustainability communications and how well they align to your sustainability activities. And you can go all the way from not prioritized or a blank screen. You can see the journey and the maturity model there to all the way up to ahead of the curve, meaning you're sort of a leading edge practitioner. And while you're taking a minute or so to fill that out, let me just also recognize our other webinar collaborators. We've got the brand sustainability solution team. You're going to be hearing from some of them today, from Emergent, the brand experience group at Informed Sustainability, along with Bill Kies, principal of Kies Consulting, and along with Mike Gorshe, formerly of Accenture, and now with the Gorshe Group. So I hope that we've got enough responses to our poll now so that we can look at the results. Okay. Interesting. So nobody's leading edge, which is good to see, because what we find is that most responses to this question overestimate your sustainability readiness by a whopping 25%. So that's enough to move your starting the journey response down all the way down to not prioritize. And it looks like for most folks, they're either at the beginning of their journey or making progress. And for, over 10%, not prioritized at all. So this is a very timely and topical event that we're doing today. So that's why we're here. We're going to talk about the state of the consumer in relation to your sustainability concerns. We're going to talk about best practices in building or at least pressure testing an effective sustainability plan, as well as communications. And we're really going to talk about the crux issue of turning your sustainability program into a business driver and competitive advantage. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Bob Wheatley in just a minute. Let me introduce our presenters. Lawrence Hutter, Chairman of the Brand Experience Group out of the UK. Michael Bambrick, Executive Director of Global Client Service at the Brand Experience Group. And Isaac Emery, Founder of Informed Sustainability Consulting out on the West Coast in Seattle. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Bob Wheatley, CEO of Emergent. Bob?
Thanks so much, Mark. It's just a delight to be with you all today. It bears, I think, emphasizing here at the very front end of our meeting that the business case for sustainability is compelling. You all in the food and beverage business, whether that be on the CPG side or on retail, would recognize the emergence and growth of health and wellness as a key priority for consumers over time. There's been a transformational change take place as sustainability has risen to the forefront of what matters to people. Lori, let's move on. So at this point, the U.S. sustainability market, according to Nielsen tracking, is at $15 billion in sales and accelerating rapidly. And this is being driven by a variety of events, media attention, and other conditions that are making this a transformational platform for brands and businesses and an important piece of competitive leverage in the marketplace. With that, Lawrence is going to give us a little bit of perspective on how that translates into business outcomes for UK-based retail.
Thanks, Bob. And the impacts are clearly very real and very significant, as quantified in a very recent study that we've just run in the UK for the grocery sector. By way of context, UK grocery market's about 275 billion US, so not insignificant. And as in most developed European countries, some consideration of sustainability issues for climate and society is now playing into informed choice for more than half the population. Using the Brand Experience Group's advanced voice of the consumer-based sustainability analytics, we're able to quantify the impact on people's choice of grocery retailer and on those retailers' top lines, hence the number you see on the slide. In aggregate, for the 3 largest grocery retailers operating in the UK, we can see lost sales of around $8 billion to competitors whose actions and reputations are better engaging sustainability motivated consumers. And as a general observation that I would make based on the many studies that we've conducted over the last year or so, we're seeing the impacts being much larger than most business leaders realize. So this is a big issue and it's a big opportunity if you can get it right. When we look at the impacts on each of the grocery retailers operating in the UK market individually, we see some contrasting results for the top 3. And this is kind of interesting. For retailers A and C, we deliberately wanted to kind of not share the names. We thought it was that would not be right. But retailers A and C are actually making, both of them, major commitments and progress to become more sustainable on both environmental and societal issues. However, their narratives are not seen as authentic and they're failing to engage and attract more responsible consumers. The adverse impact on their top lines, as you can see, is substantial. And that's largely footfall driven, by the way. It's just that consumers who care more are choosing not to shop with those retailers. Many of these more sustainability motivated people are shopping with their competitors. And they have a real need, retailers A and C, therefore, to strengthen the relevance of their narratives. And we'll talk more about this, but just another specific insight that we see, which that narratives that are focused on climate impact actually tend to engage people less than narratives that are focused on societal impacts. So we clearly have a big job to do around climate, but if you're going to engage individuals in your climate agenda, actually doing it through the impact of climate on people's lives is actually generally we see a more effective way of doing it. Now for retailer B is not doing any more than retailer A and retailer C, in terms of real environmental and societal sustainability initiatives. However, their narrative, because of the way they are sharing that with their customers and targets, actually is better engaging more responsible consumers, and they're seeing a positive share and top line impact, and it's material.
So Lawrence, thanks for that. And as Lawrence has indicated, we'll be covering this in a bit more detail in what I call a classic 2x2 in just a bit, so you can see where you are with regard to both what you're doing and how you're communicating it. I would just say for the folks joining us today, if you put it into the context of the US market, the addressable market is already about double that size, and we're really sort of just at the beginning of that journey. And if you think about consumers' emphasis on these issues, if you think about the drivers of the path to purchase historically being price, taste, and convenience, now sustainability efforts are one of those major factors that they consider, and one of their criterion in those companies that they will in effect do business with. So I like to say to companies, your values as a company these days are as important as the value of the products and services that you're providing to those consumers. Speaking of consumers, Bob, I'm going to shift it right back to you.
Thank you, Mark. So what's going on here is a rather significant move we've learned as consumers have now connected the dots between food choices and climate impacts. And as this continues to influence their behavior in the marketplace, it becomes a factor in banner selection and brand preference. And we expect that to evolve over time to include the longer term issue of food scarcity. As we kind of, Lori, move on to draw that down into some more specific understanding, look what's happened in just 3 years. 20% increase in concern over global warming in a relatively short period of time. That's just a surface symptom of what's going on with respect to change in how consumers behave in the marketplace. Lori? So we're now at a point where 64%, 2 out of 3 consumers express strong concerns about sustainability. And this is impacting their choices at retail and how they behave in the marketplace. Consumers, however, as this change takes place, are experiencing friction in how they enter the shopping environment because it's getting increasingly difficult to execute their preferences. 67% here we're seeing among female shoppers who are finding it hard to know one choice from another as to whether it's more sustainable, and their ability then to execute their desires in their choices. Consumers, however, are expecting brands and retailers to step in and support them along this journey. 62%, which tracks with where we see consumer sentiment around sustainability almost exactly, are willing to support companies that actively seek to offset environmental impacts. Equally so, will reject brands that aren't doing the right thing. So as much as there is a path to growth and benefit attached to doing the right thing with respect to sustainability readiness, there's a downside if it's not being performed successfully. And interestingly, only, however, 22% of shoppers can name even one brand that in their opinion genuinely cares about the environment, which suggests, I think, that businesses are not yet doing the best job they can to communicate in the marketplace about what they're up to. So as we look at this and I analyze what are the most significant gaps and barriers to sustainable purchasing, these two come to the forefront. First, over the last 10 years, we have seen this confirmed over and over and over again, increasing declines in consumer trust around statements and claims and assertions made by brands and banners. And part of that is due to a lack of knowledge. Part of that has to do with a perception that they're not always getting the honest truth. So the guidance here with respect to that is to help remove the risk. And that means to provide verified, fact-based, supported information around sustainability claims to help them come to a place where they are accepting this as valid. Over on the second side is a lack of ease in their ability to execute what they want to do at the store level. So the guidance there is really very simple. Make it easier, whether you're a CPG brand or a retail banner, to identify sustainable choices. That can be how packaging is used to call out those characteristics, how the store is organized to help them execute sustainable choices. It's very difficult to do that now. And along with that, it's important to become an educational resource, guide, and coach to the consumer on their journey to help making sustainable shopping simple. With that, we're going to move to a video that will step you through the top 10 sustainability management mistakes that we've encountered along the path as we've spent the last year studying the performance of organizations in this area. And once we've concluded the video, we're going to step into another section on insight.
Thanks, Bob, and I hope you all enjoyed the video. One of the themes that you'll all notice is emerging here strongly is that of authenticity. It's less about where you are on your sustainability journey, but more about being authentic about it, making commitments and embarking and traveling that journey. Uniquely, we measure authenticity. We position brands, position retail and consumer brands within what we call the authenticity matrix. The x-axis here represents actual ESG climate and societal impact performance, typically as reported by commercial ratings agencies such as Sustainalytics and MSCI and Refinitiv and CSR Hub. There are many. CSR Hub is an aggregator of a number of the others. Importantly, though, we also measure where retailers and consumer brands sit on the y-axis. The y-axis represents consumer engagement with the sustainability narrative, how that translates into informed choice, and how that drives share and value creation. So this is important for a retailer and for any consumer brand. If I'm top right, then I'm working hard at doing the right things. People are buying into my narrative when I talk about what I'm doing, and I'm creating value sustainably. I'm drawing people, if you like, into the circular economy. So this is a good place to be. If I'm bottom right, and by the way, retailers A and C in that study I shared with you a few minutes ago are bottom right. So if I'm bottom right, I'm working hard at doing the right things, just as those businesses that are sitting in the top right, those brands in the top right, but my narrative isn't landing and I'm losing the opportunity to translate all of the good things that I'm doing into value sustainably. So in this case, I really need to understand how I can improve the relevance of my narrative, and that might mean revisiting elements of my sustainability strategy as well, because clearly, I'm not translating it into value. If I'm top left, well, I'm telling a good story and people are believing it for now, but in reality, it's not supported by the fundamentals. This is a very dangerous place to be. This is greenwashing. And you'll all know that a number of apparel businesses, for example, and some food businesses have found themselves in that space over the last 12 months. If I'm bottom left, well, you could say I'm keeping my head below the parapet, but in this increasingly sustainability driven world that we're living in, my long-term relevance as a retail or consumer brand, has got to be called into question. And by the way, when we look at, as we did in the UK study, grocery, for example, as a sector, we see all the grocers positioned in this matrix. So every grocer can see how they benchmark against their peers and competitors. It's also a very important map for investors to see, because they can see where value is being created and where value might be at risk.
We are going to shift gears now and devote the remainder of our time together to talking about the solution. And this begins with taking a hard look at the key components of an integrated and we believe efficacious strategy to addressing sustainability readiness. All right. In order for us to kind of think about this, we need to take a hard look at the sustainability strategic platform that sits underneath. And this begins with looking at how consumers now link climate impacts to sustainable food choices as a fundamental driver of change in behavior, coupled to what brands want, which is to achieve alignment with consumer sustainability beliefs and values. In other words, these two things are interconnected. And that it has to be supported by tangible investments in readiness as evidence of what that communication, that commitment looks like. We've learned as we've gone through this process that when sustainability commitments are fully embedded in a brand or banner's higher purpose, mission, and values, the whole thing translates more credibly and believably than if it's simply a construct in the marketing plan that's built on top of a perception that the shifts are taking place in consumer sentiment. The reason why that's so important, because what we're trying to get to is consumer trust, because you all know that consumer trust is related to driving loyalty, purchase, and growth. So why all of that matters is very simply because sustainability is a trust creation engine. Here we have the key components of an integrated strategic approach to solving sustainability readiness. It goes clockwise from the top, starting with science-based environmental performance and assessment. You have to do that work because until you know where you are, you can't know where you're going. And everything else that follows has to be informed by your understanding of where the brand and business is with respect to carbon impact, and then how that translates into mitigation commitments and standards, which becomes a part of everything else. Consumer insight is the next key component because that's so important to understanding what are the key areas of sustainability that matter to your stakeholders. And we've found in some cases what the brand or business thinks is the most important aspect of sustainability actually doesn't match up with what consumers believe matters to them. And as a part of that, it's important to establish the metrics and infrastructure to measure business performance in relationship to all of that. Finally, all of this works well as an ecosystem when an integrated communications plan is attached to it to build the brand narrative around what's happening over here on insight and science-based analysis, and then translating that into outreach that helps inform stakeholder audiences about what you're doing. So here's the one area we keep running into over and over again as a aha moment for businesses along the path of trying to determine what matters is the challenge in food, beverage, and food retail is in the food itself. And the reason for that is that agriculture is the second largest source of greenhouse gases and the largest user of land and water resources that there is. So when you look at sustainability best practices, it has to take into consideration the supply chain, what's going on with vendors, what's happening within your brand portfolio, and how all of that will filter down into credible storytelling on the other end.
And I think that will also lead us into a discussion of the environment, Bob, from an end-to-end standpoint. And I think for that, we're going to turn it over to Isaac.
Thank you. So I'm the environmental scientist on this panel, also probably the token millennial on this panel. And I've got over 10 years of experience in assessing where our impacts, environmental impacts come from and which environmental impacts are important. And that's what we're going to touch on briefly here. So the food sector and the food retail is somewhat unique in that when we think about the kinds of environmental impacts that we want to improve and the metrics that we're working on within our own organizations as retailers, The impacts that we're thinking about are our energy use, transportation, packaging, refrigeration, those kinds of things. And when it comes to food, those kind of low-hanging fruit, those things we can do easily, are only very small pieces of the overall picture of our overall carbon footprint. So this chart here, and I promise there won't be too many charts, shows the carbon footprint of a variety of foods and also where that carbon footprint comes from. And what you see is distinctly a pattern. There's a lot of meat and animal products at the top of this chart, really high impact. And the source of that impact is not necessarily at processing, it's not necessarily in food miles, even in packaging or retail refrigeration, it's in actually growing the food itself. And that's true not only of beef, of course, famously for methane, all the way down to, unfortunately for me, chocolate and coffee, also fish, eggs, milk, and a couple of higher impact plant products as well. And what we see is what that means for our opportunity and for our communications is when we're thinking about the total carbon footprint, for example, or the total land use or water use of this retail system that we're trying to create, we can't only focus on our own organizations, and we can't only focus on the store environment. And so thinking about this large scale impact really is critical to both to being authentic and to having the most impact across our supply chain. So the bad news is that it's complicated and that you have to think broadly. The good news is there are a lot of assessments out there. There's a lot of tools for us to use to do that. So this chart shows sort of the course of the whole supply chain from the perspective of the GHG protocol, which is one of the best standards we have for actually measuring our carbon footprint emissions. And that is, the GHG protocol is used by a lot of those standards organizations and complies with them as well, that Lawrence was mentioning earlier. So when we think about what's happening at our facilities, that's our scope 1, our company facilities, our company vehicles, and that's just a small picture of what we have to consider. We've got to consider the electricity that we buy, of course, the fuels that we buy, and especially in food, it's all about those aspects on the far left of the chart here, purchased goods and services, fuel and related emissions for our suppliers. And incorporating that is really critical, not only to help us be complete, it's to help us reduce risk, and again, to comply with these standards that help us communicate effectively. So we're engaging with this new type of accounting, environmental accounting, and it's important to reduce our risk so that we can engage with rely less on terms like natural, which some of us have a pet peeve about, and are essentially meaningless in the United States, and more terms that and an engagement with consumers on claims that can be measured and certified. So on climate, for example, there's the Science-Based Targets Initiative that tells us that our business is complying with efforts to meet the Paris Climate Accords. There's Rainforest Alliance certification to avoid deforestation and limit our land use, and such like that. So there's many out there. We won't go into all of those today, but you have to measure your baseline to know what you're trying to change. And so that's really what we're looking at here. And integrating that activity is really critical. So obviously that's not something that your sustainability team can do alone. It's something that you're going to have to work across the industry, not only vertically, from suppliers to producers, to your own retail chain and potentially your packaging associates, but also across disciplines, not only with sustainability, corporate sustainability folks, like potentially yourselves, with scientists like myself, with, but also understanding what your producers are trying to do and what the consumers actually want to hear. Because obviously it's great to have impacts on environmental metrics to reduce your climate emissions or your land use or your water use, but you have to communicate the issues that the consumers want to hear most about. So we'll switch over now to Mike from BXG to talk about.
Hi everybody, Mike speaking. So the next step in applying best practices is to bring in the piece, which is understanding how all of that effort and commitment to reducing impact and to being a better part of society is actually contributing to value creation from the point of view of three things. One is the bringing an understanding of what the consumers in your category think about sustainability, what matters to them, which are the issues that drive most of their attention, and which types of consumers are the ones that are most engaged. Two, how is my brand currently doing in this? Are we, on that 2x2 that we showed you earlier, below the midpoint on the y-axis? So we're not communicating effectively and therefore not engaging with people who care, or are we? And thirdly, if we need to improve our performance, what do we do next? The diagnostic stuff that any business needs in order to support decision making. The first thing to do is for your market and your category to get an understanding of how many people are really strongly engaged with sustainability issues, enough that it makes a difference to the way that they think about brands, and who are those people. So this graphic shows you an example of that. It's not general learning, but it's a good example of something that you might expect to see. So on the left, we're able to split a sample of consumers into those who really care and are passionate about sustainability issues at the top, all the way down to those who don't know or don't care about those issues. And just for you all to know, that's done with a very specific technique that looks at how people behave in relation to sustainability. So it's not claimed behavior. Now, it's important that in the majority of categories in Western developed markets, we see that the top three boxes, passionate, committed, concerned, represent the majority of a population. And that's important because those people are the ones who do change their behavior with brands, depending on the sustainability narratives that they're getting. So this is no longer a minority issue of just a few people who might be prepared to pay a premium. It's the majority of the population. And then the second thing that this shows you on the right is who those people are more likely to be. So the green bars with the indices at the end show you are they more or less likely to be in the top three boxes. So they are a little bit more likely to be women. They're quite a lot more likely to be younger. And if you look at a number of other metrics like average income, you'll see that they're more likely to be higher income, they're more likely to be higher educated, and so on. So this is telling you about the future. It's telling you that these cohorts are only likely to grow, and they are probably the customers that you want to reach. They're probably the more profitable customers as well. Next slide, please. So once you know who they are, then you can go and look at what do they care about the most. So one of the things that you can do is to take a very broad spectrum of sustainability issues. In this case, we've used the UN Sustainability Development Goals as a framework. And the heat map shows you what are the things that those people are most engaged with, and down to red, the ones that they are least engaged with. So you can see that they are strongly engaged with some issues much more than others. And interestingly, it's not the same for everybody. That might be an obvious thing to say, but it's kind of useful to be able to show that. And that's true across age breaks, it's true across types of income and education, and it's also true within regions and across countries. If you look at what this looks like in urban East Coast versus rural Midwest, it looks quite different. Once you know who the consumers are and what is it that they care about, then you need to start measuring how your brand is connecting with those people and whether the sustainability narrative that you are delivering is driving value or maybe is taking value away from your business currently. The way that we do this is to establish a basic set of demand generation impacts. Okay, so in other words, how is your business doing on the left-hand side in terms of overall share of consumer engagement? So how are you communicating with your audience in total? And then by understanding how that communication is converting into behavior, we understand the market share that each business is doing. And then on the right, well, how are those numbers impacted by people who care about sustainability or people who don't care about sustainability. So in other words, we're now looking at the performance to understand relative to the environmental and social impact that your business is delivering. So the x-axis on that previous 2x2 that we showed. Are we engaging people successfully with our sustainability narrative? If we're doing that better, then we're likely to be creating more value. How many customers are we getting of people in the sustainability group, the top 3 boxes, benchmarked versus our competitors in the category? So we can see whether we are bringing enough people through the door who are those that care about sustainability. And then once they are with us, are we successfully converting those people into becoming customers? And therefore, what's the market share impact? And in the end, the last piece of this puzzle is to bring that all back to what's the financial impact of the business of whether we are successfully engaging, converting, and achieving market share. So being able to put a sustainability dividend if we are doing it successfully, or a deficit if we are currently leaving value on the table. Next slide, please. So the key takeaway from all of this is that you really need to think about and start putting into place a measurement program, because what gets measured matters to businesses. We all know this very well. So one of the things that we'd invite you to do is to take a look at whether you have a good measurement program to understand your sustainability commitments and the investments that you're making in those programs, whether you understand the market share opportunity of turning on a strong sustainability narrative, and whether you are currently leveraging that. In other words, what are your market share outcomes? And as a result of that, whether you're getting the growth and the return on the sustainability investments that you should be. Okay. Now, all of this is important, and none of it will happen unless the last part that we're going to talk about now is done well, which is taking all of that consumer and category understanding and turn it into a compelling narrative. So that's the piece that we're going to look at next, which is what are the best practices to actually take all of those facts and turn them into something that embeds into the way that the brand delivers itself to consumers, for which I'm going to hand back to Bob.
Thank you, Mike. Bob?
Well, when Lawrence took us through that 2x2, you all took note that there is the left-hand side an area called volcano. What's driving that condition is increased media attention around the whole issue of sustainability, and media getting more savvy, aware, and engaged in this topic means that they understand best practices from something less than that. And so what you say needs to be backed up by what you do. Here we have an example of two narratives. On the left, from McDonald's, a statement made, when you eat one of our world famous burgers, you're joining a movement towards a more sustainable future, followed by an investigative report done by Bloomberg News, published globally, that said, in essence, beef is responsible for about a third of McDonald's climate footprint. At more than 53 million metric tons, McDonald's produces more emissions than Norway, and took them to task over making statements ahead of having the proper mitigation policies in place to address the issue, as opposed to Beyond Meat, which over here has said in their communications to the marketplace that they are shifting from animal to plant-based meat. We can positively affect the planet, the environment, the climate, and even ourselves. After all, positive choices we make every day, no matter how small, can have a great impact. Followed by the University of Michigan corroborating their statements, validating it, and authenticating it. Hence, it's important to make sure that there is alignment there as you step into the communication side of the equation. We can move on. So here we have the key components that ladder up to how you design an effective, aligned communications platform that fits with your mitigation strategies. Fact-based environmental data combined with consumer insight benchmarked against business goals, and integrated into your business's higher purpose, values, and mission are all the key components that lead to how you create a brand narrative built around trust that is verified, it is relevant, it's sustainable, and meaningful. And that brand narrative becomes the underlying foundation of how you tell the story. And we might go back to Lawrence's comment earlier about UK food retail performance, that in those cases we had retailers who were doing the right thing and not communicating successfully, not getting credit for it, hence the business performance opportunities weren't realized. Let's move on. So here is the 360-degree communications platform for sustainability readiness. And as I mentioned this to you, I should also say that in our conversations with other brands and businesses, we've seen repeated over and over again that they are concerned about their ability to successfully convey to stakeholder audiences what they're doing. So here we have the preparation components on the left. Fact-based science metrics matter. That's where you start, because that leads to the development of standards and commitments that sit underneath it and become a component part of the communication strategy. That informs an authentic narrative because it's based on verified information. That leads us to the opportunity to identify proof point stories in the supply chain that bring it to life. And we would add to that a component related to third-party validation, using outside third-party respected voices to add a measure of credibility to the entire communications platform. And being careful to identify and select appropriate NGO relationships and partnerships, pardon me, that can align and support the entire effort. On the activation side, it starts with building the right tools that take all of these things we've done on the left and build a narrative that falls out from that. Then as we look below that, we can see how all of these components manifest in store-level communications and activation, in educational collateral and assets that become a part of the communication strategy across multiple channels, engaging in earned media, which is a super credible channel of communication with an informed audience, again, as I said earlier, that can recognize the difference between best practices and something less than that. So you have to take that into account. And your NGO partners can be a part of that effort. Followed by social channel, which is such a key component in how we achieve engagement with consumers, because that's a two-way conversation. It's also an opportunity to seek social proof by way of consumer voices, especially weighing in to say, yes, what this brand and business claims they are doing, they are, in fact, doing. And then all of this is wrapped up and supported by ongoing, consistent, continuous sustainability reporting on your mitigation practices, standards, commitments, and activities. So as we look at all of this, I'm sure many of you are wondering, well, where are we really on the pathway to sustainability readiness? Here are 4 questions that we think are important to think about. First, are you confident that you've got the infrastructure set up correctly for independent third-party carbon footprint analysis? Where are your carbon impacts currently? Second, does your organization have a clear plan that articulates brand value and growth? This needs to be connected to business metrics on the other end. Secondly, do you have an actionable understanding of where messages perform with your key stakeholder audiences? In other words, are we talking about the right things with respect to what people care about? Have we evaluated our messaging strategy to make sure it's in league and aligned with what they're interested in? And finally, Are our stories succinct and repeatable among employees, suppliers, vendors, and stakeholders? Well, it might be a little bit more about the technique of how that's packaged and presented in the end, but it's a key component nonetheless along the path. Which leads us to one of the more exciting parts of this presentation, and I was looking forward to mentioning this to you. We have designed a digital sustainability readiness questionnaire as a self-assessment tool. It takes 6 minutes to do. It's online, it's clickable, it doesn't require a ton of time, but it provides an assessment of where your brand and business is currently against these 5 areas, as we see here on the right, of readiness, from not prioritized all the way up to ahead of the curve. And the questionnaire follows these 4 areas of understanding carbon footprint, where the consumer is, where you are on business performance, and finally communications. We've done this enough times now that we have kind of a benchmark within categories to make comparisons. And this questionnaire has a math component built underneath that, as you answer it, creates scoring. So here's the payoff. For all of you who have registered for this webinar today, we are going to be sending you, after this is over, a link to the questionnaire, inviting you to take it. We will provide the analysis and outcomes report at no charge to you. And I can say consistently, we've seen that it is revealing and will create aha moments as you identify blind spots that you haven't seen before. So encourage you to do it.
Thank you, Bob. So I'm going to move very quickly now through operationalizing sustainability for competitive advantage. I do want to leave a couple minutes for Q&A because we've received some really good questions over the course of the webinar. But I think this is really important. As you identify your current state and you figure out your roadmap and where you want to be and how you're going to get there, there's a big difference between those nice to efforts or just kind of currying popular favorable opinion from various external stakeholders, then taking this really sort of comprehensive integrated approach. And as you can see here, the time is now. I like to say these issues have moved from off stage to center stage in a very short period of time. And these standards are emerging, challenging CSR approaches, and you really need to be comprehensive and deliberative in your approach. And it's not just your purpose, it is the process. A well thought out, well implemented process that is led from the top down and really is imbued within the entire enterprise is critically important. And I think as Lawrence and Bob and Isaac and Mike have all pointed out, activity doesn't necessarily equate directly or correlate directly to strategic business performance efficacy. And so be very, very mindful of that as you create your path forward. Obviously, siloed activity will produce siloed results. We've seen that in other areas of the business through the years. This will be no different. This is really important. It goes back to what Bob just said about the assessment tool. Third-party pressure testing, the fact that they're providing this tool to at least give you a foundation. And once you have that foundation, to continue to pressure test along the way, to hold yourself accountable to the objectives that you set for yourself will be critically important. And remember, this is that sort of upper left hand in the 2x2 that Lawrence talked about earlier. Communications are going to be subject to acute scrutiny. So if you're just talking the talk and not walking the walk, you are going to be at risk. And then, of course, lastly, the time is now. There is a growing sense of urgency along with the importance of these efforts going forward. And just to put this into context, Bob, I know you're going to quote a couple of folks within the space.
One thing I wanted to draw your attention to, and here we have a statement from Stephen at the World Federation of Advertisers, who I think we brought this forward because we keep running into it. There's a tendency when you're looking at something like this, it's a complex subject. There are a lot of pieces and parts to it, a lot of components involved, to say, in essence, we've got a lot of work to do before we go out the door with any of this. And I think his statement here is important in where he says, a systematic change, no one can pretend that they know they can come out with perfection because it doesn't exist. What he's trying to say here is don't wait to be perfect. It's time to go. It's a running, you'll be building the ship as you go. It's important to go as opposed to wait until you've got every single aspect of this worked out fully. And if you think you're going to get to perfection in the process, probably not going to do that anyway. So don't wait. And then second retailer we wanted to bring to your attention who is really making substantial progress in sustainability readiness is Raley's, based in Sacramento, California. This is a progressive retailer who has made strides over the years in their embracing of higher purpose around health and wellness. They've come to an understanding and point of view of the significance and importance of sustainability as a perfect segue, at least we believe, in their banner strategy and positioning to weigh in on that under Mark's guidance, who is their sustainability chief. I want to draw attention to the third sentence in his statement because it's a critical point. To be truly successful, sustainability initiatives must be integrated throughout the entire organization, starting with the leadership team. If the leadership team isn't engaged strategically in looking at sustainability because it's such an important and significant driver of competitive advantage in the marketplace, it's not going to be as successful as it could be. So just encouraging all of you as you look at this to make sure that engagement on the issue is happening at the leadership team level.
Great, thanks, Bob. Just before we turn it over to a couple of questions, we do have this ecosystem of sustainability tools and resources for our attendees' use. In the upper left, you'll see the link to the Sustainability Readiness Questionnaire. No need to click on it now because we will be sending it to you when we send our follow-up email. There's a couple of special reports that will be in the deck that we send you that you have access to. I'd be remiss if I did not point out that FMI has a sustainability resources page, and you'll be able to click to that, and there's an awful lot of information up there as well. You can sign up for this trend report and sustainability best practices from the Brand Sustainability Solution Group. And there will be some follow-up tools, tips, and best practices, so stay tuned for that as well. There's a link for questions, but before we wrap up, Laura, you can go to the next slide, but I did want to at least get to one or two of the questions in the audience because we had some good ones. This one is for you, Isaac, I believe, which is, what are the best ways to measure land use changes, direct and indirect land use changes? You had that the performance metrics infographic. Can you address that question?
I can. So land use change, especially indirect land use, that a phrase maybe most of you may not be familiar with, but if you're in the biofuel space or familiar with some of the issues around the performance of ethanol and beef, that may ring true to you. It's extraordinarily challenging. And so I would say it's a phrase that comes up a lot, land use change in the environmental space. For the purposes of a retailer or a food producer, I would say the best thing to do is to focus on the land use footprint of individual products and where you're able to make improvements there, either within a product group or between product groups. So just like with the climate change, the carbon footprint chart that was up in the slides earlier, land use footprints between foods are very different. Some foods require a lot of land to grow and some require fairly little. Same with a lot of the materials that go into packaging as well. And focusing on selecting materials and material groups, whether those are foods or packaging, that are low on the land use chart is definitely the way to highlight, rather than trying to do it can be a very challenging academic assessment of the larger economic difference between the two, which is the land use change question.
Thank you, Isaac. That's great. Time for one more, Bob. This one's for you. You have a minute or less to answer before I wrap up, because I want to hold us to the top of the hour. Somebody asked, what will the Sustainability Readiness Questionnaire outcome report tell us? So I don't know if you, through your established baseline, already have some idea, but I think for the users who fill that out, what can they expect to see back?
Look, I think the best way to answer that succinctly is simply to say, in every single case that we've gone through the questionnaire exercise, we have found it reveals blind spots. Even when an organization feels like they have made the proper moves, we've discovered over and over again that the questionnaire will point up some areas that haven't been addressed as yet. So if that's an opportunity for key learning, then it's really worth doing, because it doesn't take that much time, and the opportunity to identify some areas that still need to be addressed is there.
Super. Thanks. Thanks, Bob. Thanks to all of you. Just in summary, just to sort of go through this sort of tick list of what we covered here today. We obviously talked about making the business case for sustainability. We talked about common mistakes that companies make along the way. We talked about what sustainability means from a consumer standpoint, and that driver to the path to purchase, and what a preference driver it is becoming. We went rather quickly through a series of best practices. You'll be able to spend a bit more time with that when we send this out later. And we will also provide far more in the way of resources to pressure test your own current state and desired future state as well. I'd like to thank our partners at Kies Consulting and the Gorshe Group. I'd like to particularly thank our partners at the Brand Sustainability Solution, Bob, Lawrence, Isaac, Mike. Thanks all very, very much. And thank you all for joining. We look forward to following up accordingly. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.